All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Sheena Campbell. I'm a student services librarian at the UC Davis Library, and I work as part of the AggieOpen team to coordinate our open education initiatives and programming. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us from around the country and around the world during this year's Open Education Week. You join us from the University of California, Davis. We are a public land-grant university in Northern California, located on the ancestral lands of the Patwin Band of the Wintun peoples. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Cachel-Dehi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, the Quetzal-Dehi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dehu Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. You can learn more about their governance, heritage, and sovereignty using the links provided in the chat. We are honored and grateful to advance public scholarship from their traditional lands. Since its inception, open education has been seen as advancing equity as a movement to reduce barriers to information and resources for our students. The affordances of open education have the potential to increase equity by democratizing scholarly communication and reducing barriers to higher education. However, as we look for tools and strategies to increase the availability of these open educational resources, we must be cognizant of their corollary impacts. As computing demands for artificial intelligence and cloud storage grow at a great pace, so do the inequitable environmental consequences. As we imagine new ecosystems of sharing knowledge and information, how do we avoid the pitfalls of reproducing the same inequities of the systems we're hoping to re-envision? The UC Davis Library's AggieOpen Invited Speaker Series seeks to advance public scholarship in the field of open education. Each Open Education Week, we bring distinguished educators to share their research and work promoting a more equitable educational environment. The work of this year's AggieOpen Invited Speaker, Marco Seiferle-Valencia, investigates the intersection of information technology, environmental justice, and open education. Marco Seiferle-Valencia serves as the University of Idaho's open education librarian. He grew up in Northwest New Mexico in the shadow of many ongoing ecological disasters stemming from coal power production, fracking, and uranium production. His areas of research interest include social and environmental justice, education as a vehicle for personal and social liberation, and community archives, particularly those with a BIPOC focus. Today, Professor Seiferle-Valencia will deliver their talk, AI Spring, Generative AI, Open Education, and Climate Catastrophe. He invites us to consider the environmental impacts of generative AI by examining the often hidden ecological costs of these new tools, and asks how we as open practitioners can ensure the burgeoning collaboration between AI tools and open education serves our learners, teachers, and the environment. It's great to have you with us, Professor. Before we get started, I'll note that the talk is being recorded. Our chat is enabled, but we ask that you post any questions you would like to pose for the speaker during the Q&A, using that Q&A chat where I can collect and pose them at the conclusion of the talk. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here. I see we have about 90 attendees right now, so super flattering, super humbled, and thank you especially to my family and friends that I see attending. It's wonderful to see both colleagues and also people from my personal sphere in here. So thank you for being here. I'm really honored to give this presentation, and especially honored to give this presentation at UC Davis, a school that I've long admired. I particularly have really admired the environmental work that's come out of this school, especially historically in the 1960s and 1970s, was very inspirational. In some ways, just a perfect alignment for the talk that I'm going to give today. So with that, I'm going to dive right into it because this is quite a thorough presentation we have here. So I'll try to pace this well enough that we have time for some questions at the end, because I would love to engage you all in a conversation about this as well. So let me close this chat that I was looking at. Um, Sheena is nice enough to be managing the Q&A as mentioned. So sorry if you post things in the chat. I will probably not be able to see them while driving, because texting and driving is not a skill I have. So let's just kind of dive in here, and I will do a little screen share and hit my slide deck. Okay. So this talk is titled AI Spring, Generative AI, Open Education, and Climate Catastrophe. And at first I thought this was maybe a little bit too bombastic of a title. But to be honest, I'm undergoing tenure review as we speak. And part of the deal I made with myself was that I wanted to really practice speaking the truth to power and saying what I thought and doing my research in a way that was really aligned with as much of myself as possible. And so I'm kind of going for it in this deck, and it might not be exactly what people are expecting, but I hope it inspires some thought and certainly lets you know maybe some things that you didn't know before. I will also say this talk can maybe be a little bit depressing, and so I hope that isn't the only outcome that comes of it for folks. So let's kind of dive in, I guess, with that sort of ominous intro. So as mentioned, I'm Marco Seiferle-Valencia. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Assistant professor at the University of Idaho. I'm also a co-creator of the Chicana por Madrasa Digital Memory Collective, which is the largest known digital collection of Chicana feminist histories, especially 1960s and 1970s era. So I'm joining you from Moscow, Idaho, which is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu, the Palouse, and the Coeur d'Alene tribes. This is our official land grant, land acknowledgement. We are the state's land grant school. And so it says that U of I Moscow is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu, Palouse, and Shitsumush tribes. We extend gratitude to the indigenous people that call this place home since time immemorial. U of I recognizes that it is our academic responsibility to build relationships with the indigenous people to ensure integrity of tribal voices. University of Idaho land acknowledgement. So that's our official land acknowledgement. Anyone who's been to some of my previous talks knows that I will often criticize land acknowledgements for being performative, or sort of being like saying, well, I acknowledge I stole your car, and that doesn't necessarily help you get your car back. In fact, it doesn't help you get your car back at all. And so I always try to include an ask or an action when I do a land acknowledgement. So for today's action, I'm going to start off by letting you know a little bit more about where I am. So this is the Nez Perce. Nez Perce National Park basically is an interesting kind of collaboration between the tribe and the National Park Service. This is a map that they have on their website, and it shows the current reservation as well as the original homelands, as well as some of the other tribes in this area. And so I often like to think of this area as being the Palouse region. So that would really be sort of this area here, as opposed to being North Idaho or Eastern Washington. And that's one of the ways that I genuinely try to internalize a different way of thinking about geography, land, and history. This place is very beautiful. So this is Whitebird, Idaho. This is about an hour south of here, maybe an hour and a half. And this is one of the Nimiipuu homelands. So Nez Perce people are migratory, or were migratory, and so they have a number of homelands in this region that are important and were places that they were living at depending on what was going on there seasonally. Another important area is here. So this is the confluence of the Clearwater and Snake River. And this is Lewiston, Idaho. So this is just about 30 minutes south of where I am, arguably the closest big city. This is where there's a Costco. And we actually drive an extra hour and a half to go to a different Costco, because this place is so polluted from heavy industry. And so there's a joke on the internet, and it's Lewis and Clark looking at some falls, which this is kind of a grim joke from a native perspective, because of course a lot of falls were destroyed to build the dams that were here, and with that went salmon and subsistence fishing, and arguably it's a cultural genocide. And so these dams, were put in to develop agriculture and industry and so on and so forth. And really what we did get is something that looks a lot like that is actually looks so much like Lewiston. I thought it was, until I was getting ready for this presentation, and I discovered that's somewhere in Pennsylvania. So librarian fact checking always pays off for me to learn new things, even as I'm getting ready for something like this. But yeah, kind of thinking about the legacy of this place. And this is the heavy paper production. And so for those who remember in 2020, when you couldn't get toilet paper or paper towels and things like that, it was partly because all of these plants had shut down. And so you think about this kind of foresty area, and all of these trees basically come out of here and they get turned into paper products. And the result is a bunch of air pollution that makes Lewiston smell kind of like sauerkraut. And there's a lot of environmental illness associated with this region. And so thinking about where we are and the kind of environmental consequences of colonization is something that's important to me, and that I think is important when we're talking about some of the subjects I'm going to talk about in this topic. So that's why I chose to include these items in my land acknowledgement. And with that, we'll kind of get into the talk. So the title of this talk was AI Spring, which I was a little reluctant about because I was afraid people would think I was referencing Arab Spring, which was a different, very important political movement in the early 2010s era. But really, it's a reference to the novel Silent Spring, which is, I guess it's not, I shouldn't say it's a novel, it's a nonfiction book written by Rachel Carson. And it's all about the incoming environmental damage and cataclysm basically caused by pesticides. So when pesticides come out, people think they're just great. It's going to be so awesome from our agriculture. And she really puts forth a lot of groundbreaking research in this book that helps to highlight the dangers of this widespread pesticide adoption. And so we're going to start with this quote where she says, "Have we fallen into a mesmerized state that makes us accept as inevitable that which is inferior or detrimental, as though having lost the will or the vision to demand that which is good?" And so I encourage you to hold this thought in your mind as you think about AI. And as also part of an example that we're going to do here, I want you to try to get a sense of what 50 minutes actually is like. And I thought of a lot of different ways to try to convey this and sort of go performance artistry with it, and it didn't quite work out. But what I want someone to do is, if some brave, intrepid participant in the chat is willing to say 45 minutes from now, raise your hand, make a fuss, let me know when it's been 45 minutes. And I just want all of us to kind of mark right now, this is the start of this, and you'll see why. So just kind of trust me, just go along on this. And if someone could say it's been 45 minutes, or maybe Sheena, our intrepid moderator, maybe you could help with that. Since you're the person I can see on chat, that'd be great. So with that, let's keep going. So why this quote for this talk about AI, which a lot of people are very excited about? Well, first, you got to learn a little bit about me and why we're here. So I'm Marco Seiferle-Valencia. I'm an open education librarian at the University of Idaho. I've been really fortunate to receive a wonderful reception from the open community for a lot of my scholarship and research on the OER potentials of, or social justice potentials of, open educational resources, and more specifically, some of the Black feminist and brown feminist histories that include a lot of the concepts that we consider to be integral to open education, but are often typically cited as emerging in the 1990s. So for me, this was a way of partly integrating some of my previous work with perspectives that I knew had articulated a lot of these same points that I saw being sort of defined by a 1990s forward vision of open. And I wanted to say, no, actually, BIPOC people have been here doing this for quite a while, and also that there's a lot of radical potentials in open to address the limitations of current curriculums. And so there's a few presentations that I gave, the Open Education Conference, this Looking Beyond Cost, that talked about these kind of Black and brown feminist roots of open. And I want to give a shout out to Jasmine Roberts-Crew, who was our previous AggieOpen speaker last year. She actually just put out an incredible article about the Black feminist roots of OER, where she took some of my ideas here and expanded them and went further. And so I really recommend people check that out. And last year, I was lucky to do a talk at University of Iowa about the open education and El Museo Indigenista. And that basically was combining some of my work on the Chicana por Madrasa archive with open education, and thinking about how can we, again, sort of situate BIPOC people as tellers of open educational stories and practitioners of open education before we called it that. So before I did all of this, and this over here, I love putting all these logos. These are some of my scholarly affiliations and places that I've worked. And this is the University of Michigan Wolverine, in case you've never seen that. So moving forward, this all actually starts, though, way, way before this. So before grad school, before undergrad, before even high school, this was me. So I grew up in Bloomfield, New Mexico. That's this map over here on the left. And that's a pretty small town outside of Farmington, New Mexico, which is the relatively larger city in that area. And it's in the Four Corners region of those four states, those four Southwest states. And I love technology. I love building robots. And so here's me with a robot that I built that I was fortunate and competitive with and took to the International Science and Engineering Fair. And so here's me over here on the right, winning an award for this. And I guess I did an archives project recently and found these pictures and thought it'd be fun to show them. But I also want to sort of situate myself as someone who's always been interested in technology, but who's also always understood the kind of environmental costs of a lot of modernity. And one of the ways that that's really visceral for me was growing up in this extremely beautiful space. So Angels Peak is a well-known monument in Bloomfield. Shiprock in Shiprock, New Mexico is probably one of the most photographed locations in the Southwest. Also happens to be a sacred site to the Navajo or Dene people. So it's a geographically stunning place. And I spent the first 10 years of my life on a really rural property that really looked not obviously as scenic as this picture on this left, but had a very rural agrarian feel to it. And my dad actually worked at this power plant. And so this is APS, Arizona Power Service. This is the Four Corners Power Plant. And this is a ginormous power plant. When some astronauts went up in the 1980s, this and the Great Wall of China were the two things that they said they could see from space. So this thing is huge and it takes so much coal out of the earth. And I'm sort of ashamed slash embarrassed slash humble enough to say I had no idea it was so close to Shiprock until I made this presentation deck. Seeing this picture and seeing the location of this power plant and the lake that it uses for all the water and the proximity to Shiprock is really horrifying to me. I mean, I knew that my dad had to drive about an hour away to get here, and I knew that Shiprock was about an hour and 15 minutes away. But to see it so close and to see how we place something so destructive right in someone's sacred backyard is just kind of wild, right? So this is the context that I'm starting in. One of the we'll come back to this in a little bit, but just in case you don't know, this is sort of an infographic that shows a lot of the inputs and outputs of a power plant. And it's a lot more than you might think than the coal going in. It's also the water that it uses to cool itself. It's also the water that it contaminates. It's the water that's contaminated by the mining. And then it's this sort of constant stream of heavy metals and other contaminants into the environment. And just imagining this is something that's so big you can see from space, that's a lot of environmental pollution. So one of the places that this led me to was working at a place called the Center for Biological Diversity. So post-college, I actually have an undergraduate degree in photography, but I was really interested in activism and photojournalism. And I took on this project at the Center for Biological Diversity, which shout out to my friend Melissa, who I saw in the chat, a fellow intern here. We both worked 40 hours a week for $300 a month. That's right, you heard that right. For about a year on this project to create a basically this compendium that includes 350 species that are imperiled by us not achieving certain climate goals. This was in 2009. I'm sorry to say that we did not achieve the climate goals. And so some of these species have gone extinct and they all remain imperiled that are still here. And many more are kind of added onto this list. So for me, this topic has been a long time in the making, but sort of a recent synthesis of everything together. So one of the great joys in my sort of activism, ecological life was hearing that the Four Corners Power Plant was slated to be closed in 2031. And so to hear that this power plant is going to be offline, I think is great. It's extraordinarily ecologically damaging, and there's other better sources of energy for it. So we're going to start now with this quote, which is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this is by John Muir, my first summer in the Sierra, 1911. I have to give my partner Esther Kim a lot of credit for this because I said, I want to use this John Muir quote, but we've also really started having good conversations in the environmental movement about what a problematic character he is. And they said, well, you should just say, like famous racist John Muir. And I think that's a great way to kind of deal with this, because this quote that he has here is a very powerful quote. And to me, it was one of the ways that this Buddhist concept of interdependence really became clear to me. This idea that we're all in this ecosystem, and humans included, and that everything else is much more closely connected than you might realize. In the 90s, we used to call this like the 7 degrees of Brad Pitt, where you would figure out how you were actually related to a celebrity. And so it's like there's a lot of different ways of like playing with this concept. And this was the way that it first really resonated with me. But of course, we also now know that John Muir had a lot of racist views towards Native and Black people. And that's a problem in the environmental movement in general. And so I include this quote in the hopes that we can take the good while critiquing the bad, and understanding that there's a way to engage with these concepts without necessarily endorsing the person who puts forth that concept, especially since it's rarely truly someone's original concept, right? This has really been articulated by a lot of other people well. So I partly put that there because I'm sure some of us are wondering, like, why are you talking about this? Where's open education in this? And it's like, okay, well, let's bring it back around to open education. I'm sure a lot of you saw this post from David Wiley in 2024, February, just a couple weeks back. He put forth a pretty long fourth post, which I know he's also been doing a lot of presentations and speaking on this. So he's kind of sharing these ideas widely. And the self-given TLDR is as follows. In order to be relevant today and in the future, a national open education strategy must, 1, know exactly what it is trying to accomplish, and 2, deeply integrate generative AI. So the national education strategy part of this is there's partly a lot of conversations happening that I will be honest and say I have not thoroughly researched, but there's a lot of in-community conversations happening about how do we shape policies that are being constructed at a national level that inform open praxis. And that it's important for us to know what really are our goals as open practitioners. Is it about having a hard line, it's always zero cost? Is it about people having the best access for the best price? What's the sort of philosophical position and the practical position of the discipline? So he goes on to then talk a little bit in this post about his generative AI ideas. And that's really where I want to focus in, because I know that Wiley is a real thought leader in our movement. And I've seen so much adoption and excitement about AI and open. And the technology nerd in me understands and has also been excited about open. And the environmentalist in me is afraid for what's to come. And I'll sort of walk you through why that is shortly. So Wiley proposes that AI might help generate traditional OER. So I think a lot of us open practitioners are used to hearing faculty say, I don't have time to create open resources from scratch. And what if AI could help do that? What if you could have AI build your open educational resources for you? And then he proposes what might be sort of 2 new kinds of OER, which is open prompts and open models. So basically, if you've used AI before, you've given it prompts, he's suggesting what if there's pre-established open prompts that people could reuse? And then he goes a little bit further and says, what if there's whole open models that people could reuse? So instead of going to Chat GPT, you went to OpenStax GPT maybe, and then all the OpenStax textbooks were in there. So what kind of tools might come out of this that are still basically open, but are also integrating AI? So this post has a lot of things that come up for me. So the one thing that I don't want to do is have too many sidebars on this conversation. So this one I almost started making into a huge slide, and then I just decided to just stick right to it. There's a lot of scholarship already out there about the known issues with AI's racism. It's xenophobia, it's sexism, it's many isms and is, which it makes sense because it's just trained on a data set that comes off the internet. And some of them are even trained off data sets that come off of things like Reddit, which don't have particularly good reputations on those fronts. So I've included some examples here, like most top news sites block AI bots, right-wing media welcomes them. So like, what does that mean if we have a lot of AI trained on right-wing data sets? Well, it means it manifests right-wing opinions and perspectives because it doesn't actually think, it just sort of regurgitates content in correctly arranged ways. So I will probably come back to this in future topics, but I'm just sort of throwing this up here saying like there's a lot of known issues with AI that we're not even going to talk about here. We're really just going to focus in on a couple of these specific ones, which are really the environmental costs. Overall, there's been a lot of what I'm calling AI breathless takes, and they kind of manifest on either I would say a sort of fearful perspective or sort of hopeful perspective, but maybe those are kind of the same thing, because they all help to foster this sense of magical inevitability around it. Which, by the way, is like just a really great money making strategy. I read somewhere, which unfortunately I cannot cite because I read it and just didn't write it down, but it was a discussion saying that ChatGPT and Sam Altman had really made a shrewd move going around saying, oh, what if AI makes everyone extinct? And I need to have a governmental meeting about it. That was as much a shrewd stock raising and profile generating move as it was a real genuine threat of where the technology is at. And of course, these things are black boxes, and so it's hard to say for sure. But I think we are all seeing these different kinds of takes, right? So sometimes we'll see something like this futurism article on the left where it says chatbots are developing an understanding of the world, which suggests that they have minds and they can understand things. I attended a session recently where there was an article saying that if you tell AI to stop and take a breath, it does better. And people were saying, oh, that means it can think and it's breathing and it's practicing meditation and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, and then we have the sort of Terminator approach that's like maybe AI is just going to like kill all of us, you know, tomorrow, you know, or in the near future, and we should be terrified. There's some really interesting sort of thought experiments where people think if you haven't been being nice to AI already, it's going to know and punish you in the future. So there's all kinds of sort of borderline, I don't want to use the word hysteria because I think there's a strong misogynist component to that, but whatever hysteria might be without that misogyny. And what I'm going to use an example is the seance. And so I think a lot of us these days would think of something as the seance as, oh, I've seen that on TV with the Ouija board and it's a joke. And, you know, many people feel that the modern academy requires a kind of skepticism towards the spiritual, and at the same time will apply what are effectively magical thinking beliefs about AI to that discipline, right? So like if AI can think or talk or create, then we have effectively created life from matter, right? And it's an equivalent claim to something like Frankenstein or an extra dimensional communication. And I'm actually not even saying those things are or not possible. I'm just saying that's where that situates that claim. So a lot of people don't know that seances were at their time very, very popular. They were extremely profitable. They were engaged with by people at all levels of society, including scholars and politicians of great renown, established, respectable people, so to speak. Some of the commonalities that I also see are that it plays into this deep-seated human desire to connect with other humans and also to speak with a human intelligence of non-human origin. I think it's pretty fair to say that's something that humans have sort of been obsessed with for the entire time that we've been humans. And AI kind of offers a modern take on that. It's a modern version of that because we maybe as a layperson feel like we don't know how it works, there's a sort of magicalness about it. And I think that obscures that it threatens real actual life. Like AI is not alive, but it has real negative impacts on real life, which we'll go into that. And I think just the kind of key here is that it simulates life or intelligence where there isn't any, right? So even your most, if you subscribe to a sort of hierarchy of animals, even animals that have your most basic thought functions still have more thought than even the most advanced, sophisticated, or impressive AI, because they actually have an organic mind that can generate thought, whereas AI cannot do that. This is a quote from Jack Kornfield, Buddha's Little Instruction Book. It's often misattributed to Buddha himself. And the quote is, "The trouble is you think you have time." And what this is really referring to is the sort of human tendency to put off what needs to be done and to engage denial as a strategy by saying, oh, there's time to do that later. And Buddhism, that's part of this idea that you're you like to think of your fixed permanent self. And so when you say I'm going to do that later, it's actually comforting to your ego because it's reinforcing this idea that you're going to be here later, which of course none of us can really say for sure how long we have, and that's something that's distressing to our mind. So the trouble is you think you have time. So open education and EI, TLDR, what's the problem? There's a pun for you guys. Little levity on a serious topic and a little time check for me. So AI has a lot in common with cryptocurrencies. Everything that I'm going to say here is actually also true of cryptocurrencies, which shout out Bitcoin going to the moon right now. They all use a ton of water, they use a ton of chips, and they use tons of energy. And this is partly just built into the way that they work, which I say partly because I think sometimes people think like, oh, there's going to be a technological advancement and it'll just solve it. And it's like, not so much with these guys. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit. So I said AI uses tons of water. Well, how? How does AI use water? Like, what's the relationship there? So there's this really wonderful paper here, which I'm sorry to say I didn't get a link together for this slide deck, but we'll have one ready and can share with folks because there's a lot of embedded links here. So if folks need that, feel free to reach out to me or follow up with the registration. Sure, we have something there. So this is basically the kind of two main water inputs into AI. First, you got those power plants, which, as you recall, I showed you that picture of APS, and you saw the power plant, and we went through briefly through the infograph, seeing all the water inputs there. And that includes not only water that's taken in, which is fresh, drinkable water, by the way. Power plants don't use salt water, at least not most of the ones in the United States that I'm aware of. And they also then, of course, degrade the water in the region that they're running. The other big water use, though, for data centers is they're hot and they need a ton of air conditioning. So it's like these things are like, mega Costco's, picture like 10 Costco's together and just jam it full of computers. It is like literally hot as hell in there. And so they have to just run extraordinary amounts of air conditioning, which requires a lot of water. And again, that's fresh, usually potable water, so water that humans or animals could be using, and instead it's going into these data centers. So I know some of you, have probably seen articles like this, but just in case you haven't, there's a lot of really scary things that are coming out of this. So for instance, in this article on the right, Goodyear, Arizona is a sort of suburb town in Phoenix, which is where I went to undergrad. And it's an important agricultural place. Like a lot of our food comes from this spot, and the water is being drained out of it because Microsoft is building a big data center there. So thinking about this in terms of our AI practice, what does this look like, right? Like how much water is it, and what's the real impact here? So the same article puts forward a little chart, which let me see if I can pull this up. And it actually shows by place it, sort of rough geographic location, the inference and water usage, right? And so inference is basically question to Chat GPT. Anytime you hit the return button and it has to process your input, that's an inference. And how much water does it use? And so thinking about that, I was like, well, what would this look like if I were to do a library session with AI? Fortunately, Washington, which I did assume to mean Washington State here, but could be a data error on my part. What would that look like? And so I made this little example saying I have 30 students and they're going to use Chat GPT for 10 minutes. Each student on average ends up asking 20 overall questions. I think that's a real underestimation on the questions, because I know when I use Chat GPT, I'll do like 20 questions in like 5 minutes. But just for the sake of this, assuming some of the students are under engaged because it's a library session, like how much water are we going to use here with this kind of an average? 49 minutes of faucet time. 2 full bathtubs or 80 gallons of water is the cost of that session. And so to my timekeeper here, we haven't quite hit 50 minutes, but if you can imagine that a faucet had been running the entire time I've been talking, and we probably still have about 10 or 15 minutes to go, that's how much water we would use in this one session. And this is on the sort of Chat GPT 3 version. So the future versions of it are in fact actually more data intensive, not less. So water. All right, so chips. AI uses a ton of chips, which have a lot of extreme environmental costs. They are extremely polluting in terms of where they're made, and then also how the resources for them are mined. And it's a very profitable industry. So here, Sam Altman is saying that he wants to raise up to $7 trillion to start a new chip factory to build all the chips that we're going to need for AI. And these factories are already causing horrible environmental degradation where they are, and they also require a lot of raw minerals that are, we just don't have a sustainable or safe way to mine them. And it also uses a lot of water and energy to mine them. They also themselves contribute quite a bit to greenhouse gas emissions. So this stat said 31% of global greenhouse gas emission comes from that semiconductor manufacturing in the manufacturing sector. So it's a huge, huge contribution, and not really something that we can afford to have scale up at the level that folks like Sam Altman would like to see happen, because it'd be extremely profitable for their business. Finally, AI uses tons of energy. And one of the things that's really sort of distressing to me is it uses so much that they're talking about bringing back old coal plants that were being slated to shut down, right? So coal plants like Arizona Public Service, which we know is horribly environmentally damaging to its immediate environs, and then also as a releaser of CO2 and other gases, those are actually finding new life as AI generators. And it's partly there's just so much demand for electricity, and we haven't actually derived enough sustainable electricity sources to satisfy that demand. So thinking about all of this was slated to stop at that power plant, and now it will all resume so that we have enough energy for AI. Similarly, this is just another article on the same lines. I can't remember the depressing stat off the top of my head here, unfortunately, but it doesn't really matter. I think you all get the point. There's an enormous electrical cost to this. You can find different stats that say, one round of Chat GPT uses enough electricity to power 200 homes or anything along those lines. And a lot of these things are just estimates at this point, because we don't fully know yet, but what we do know is the cost is enormous. This little article here is talking about how Sora, which is the new OpenAI kind of product that actually creates video, uses even more energy and is even more resource intensive, up to 16 times the resources. So thinking back to my water example, I guess 45 minutes times 16 times is a lot. Also, I found a depressing number of YouTube videos that are like water going down a faucet for 10 hours that people took a video of. So I guess it's kind of like those. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of folks are saying, okay, what about all these solutions that we have, though? I've heard about the carbon offsets and carbon capture and, cloud seeding and all this kind of stuff. The experts are very unified in this, that there's a lot of issues with those things. And in fact, things like carbon offsets are actually becoming carbon onsets or carbon expenditures as forests start to burn, unfortunately. And all experts are pretty much aligned in that we need to be using less energy and water, not more. And so there is a real issue here in that we have this exciting technology, which has this horrible environmental cost at this time that we need to be particularly conservation minded with our resources. It's a situation where maybe in 20 or 30 years, if AI helps us develop great power solutions, maybe we wouldn't have to be so cautious about the use of it right now. But some of these resources are always going to have a hard limit to them, like water. And I just think that we partly have to start having these conversations and thinking about the environmental impact in our respective disciplines and practices. So I want to just sort of underscore here, and sorry for this little typo here. This is a quote from Pema Chodron. It's actually a couple of quotes smushed together, which is why it's got that little typo issue. And it says, hope is a four-letter word, abandon hope. And this is kind of a depressing little quote here. So I'll explain it a little bit more in just a second. But I really want to underscore to people that there's like serious problems, and like scientists are really worried and hitting the panic button in a way that I think we should be listening to them. And I think it's impossible to say that you're an evidence-based practitioner and just sort of discard the worries around this. We're on track for the worst outcomes. And I called it climate catastrophe and not change, because we're on track for things that could seriously imperil the civilization, the overall survival of humans altogether, much less our sort of civilization as we know it. This quote that Pima Chodron is saying here, she says, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to renounce this tenacious hope that we could be saved from being who we are. And what does she mean by that? Well, she means like stop practicing denial, like give up this hope that it's just going to magically change without you changing. Give up the hope that someone else is going to fix it. Give up the hope that there's just a magical solution out there, and start from the premise that you and your imperfect self are containing of the solutions that we need, as opposed to there just being some external magical thing that's going to happen. So with that in mind, I also just want to sort of talk a little bit about kids' perspectives in climate change. I'm an open education librarian, which is kind of a pun because I do open education and I'm also an education librarian. And so I've really tried to focus in thinking about what does being a good ancestor to future generations look like. And children are extremely worried about climate change, and for good reason. 84% are worried, 59% report that they're very worried. This was a recent study that came out in the Lancet that all this data came from. And a lot of them are arguably experiencing what we would call signs of grief. So they're experiencing all of these emotions that are the emotions of grief. And more than 45% of them said it's impacting their daily life in a negative way. And children become our undergraduates, become our graduates, become our faculty. And I think thinking about, our undergraduate students are also trying to cope with these realities. And so how can we as open practitioners be engaging around this? So the time to do something is now. And what can we do about it in open education specifically? I think we need to think a bit about the human face of AI. So there's quite a bit of global exploitation that goes into the creation of these AI models. There's a lot of labeling and data grooming that has to go into it, and it's negatively impacting BIPOC people around the world, and sometimes kids too, which is really horrifying, especially if you're familiar with some of these issues with moderation on social media platforms, even in developed nations that have more access to mental health resources. We basically have sort of Uberized this model and have exploited workers in the global South to have these wonderful AI systems that do these things that they do. And I think something that's particularly messed up about this is that these are also the people who are more likely to be devastated by the near-term climate change impacts. And so if we look at the research, we can see that the exposure to extreme heat events, this in a world that's warmed by 2.7 degrees, which unfortunately we're pretty on track for, we actually see we have this huge swath of people. This is like 2 billion people exposed to this extreme life-threatening heat. And these are also the folks who are the least responsible for climate change. So this is what's up here on the top. Those red nations, including us, are the ones that are more responsible for climate emissions. And then this shows the vulnerability. So again, these systems that we're going to use to advance our own educational gains in the global north will come at the expense of the global south. A lot of people will say, oh, this is so great. The productivity is just so wonderful. And there's a sort of inherent positivity around it. And I really think it's worth thinking about productivity for what? If you're going to have increased productivity, is it to just be more productive in the current existing systems, which from your perspective may or may not be oppressive? And if so, is that really what you want to be more productive in? And so I've got this picture of this Hummer here because there's a lot of really sound environmental criticism that points out how, as we've developed electrical vehicle technology, we've just used it to sort of continue our obsession with huge vehicles, even though this thing uses like a 60 households power in like a month, like 60 households monthly power requirements just to charge this car for like one round of driving. So just kind of thinking through like, what is the productivity going to be for? If our faculty are going to be able to save time on creating open educational resources, what will we use that affordance for? Can we use the saved productivity to actually do something good? Can we use it to engage around climate? Can we use it to engage around equity and inclusion and diversity? Can we use it to engage around forthcoming topics in open? That would be my hope. So living here in Idaho, I'm the we have a state that's very active in sort of prescribing what can be taught in our schools. And we had a revision to our science curriculum a few years ago where cloud seeding had to be included as a viable strategy for climate change. I would love if teachers could say, hey, students, go to ChatGPT and ask it about cloud seeding, right? Because we do have pretty strong restrictions on what teachers can say in the classroom. And I think anyone who's joining in from a quote unquote red state can appreciate that. And so there's something nice about having this tool that contains a corpus of knowledge that really no one can censor at this point, and that you can say to kids like, certainly one's of appropriate age to be using internet tools, obviously, but to say like, hey, go ask your questions about cloud seeding and write your report based off of what it tells you. Are there something that we can do to maybe even have climate deniers interact with AI? And so this research right here is pretty interesting in that it shows that people who are climate skeptics, sometimes when they actually are able to talk with a chat bot about some of that skepticism, they actually come away more inclined to understand the importance of doing something to be a positive contributor to the climate issues. And this is actually one of my stats that I didn't have earlier. So ChatGPT alone might use as much power as 33,000 US households. So I'm not sure if that's per day or per year for ChatGPT, but you can be sure that number is going up. So with that, I would like to close this out with a climate pledge for open practitioners. Specifically, our educational gains cannot come at the cost of life, culture, and land for the global south and coastal poor. I don't think that we should unabashedly, uncritically embrace technology that has that outcome, even if those outcomes are a tiny bit hidden because we don't see them directly. Our education advancements must not be at the expense of human beings and other living creatures. We need to be preserving our ecosystems for ourselves and other things that are alive. AI is not one of those things. Other education advancements must not come at the expense of the environment, so anything else we cook up should not be further detrimental. And advancements must be used to advance the intentional and impactful action needed now to save our climate for future generations. So if we're going to have these increased affordances, efficiencies, and productivities, I really encourage us to think about how might we use that for something good. And so with that, I'll close us out with Rachel Carson, this great quote she has: "We stand now where two roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth." So with that, I thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen now, and I welcome any questions or comments.
All right, thank you so much. I'll give folks a chance to be able to post questions using the Q&A channel. But I have a question to start us off. So I think, your point about sort of uncritically embracing or rebuking new technology is something which helps to kind of perpetuate this denial. I think denial is really facilitated by omission. And so I'm curious your thoughts about, I reviewed some institutional AI policies in higher ed prior to the talk. And I mean, understandably, a lot of these policies are very concerned with academic integrity, concerns about personal growth, intellectual growth, and critical thinking of students. But I really could not actually find an example of a higher ed institution that noted the environmental impacts of AI in their policy. And I'm wondering if that is a way to perhaps call more attention to these types of impacts, and if this is something that needs to be included in AI policy, and maybe your thoughts about how our in tackling AI in higher ed through things like policies and statements and press releases, if that's a means of drawing more attention to this.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's such interesting research that you did. And I hope that maybe you consider publishing that, if that's a thing that you want to do, because I think that would be really interesting to see. Like, I reviewed 20 of these policies and there's just no mention of this. I think there's a lot of AI issues that universities and colleges need to deal with. I think if it could be summarized in a way, I think there's an overall sort of lack of awareness around the harm potentials of AI. And so, I, for instance, saw TikTok, which I know is not the most scholarly source, but of a student saying she had gotten an AI plagiarism citation because she used Grammarly on her paper. And it's like faculty really sometimes can be so extraordinarily unskeptical about these tools. Like, I've had folks say, they just love the built-in reading thing for Canvas that shows them how long students are reading assignments. And I always kind of push back and say, like, when I try that out, it shows that I haven't read my stuff, because I read in I guess a chaotic and disorganized and fast way for the tracker. And so I've tested it and it'll literally say I'm not reading something that I am. And so it's like the kind of justice issues just built into AI overall and the vast potentials for harm. I don't know that universities on the whole are really thinking of that. And so I think this would be such a great place to launch that kind of starting point to say, like, what does preventing harm in AI look like, and how do we acknowledge environmental harm? At a broader level, I think maybe a sort of similar question to yours, which is, why the heck are libraries so underengaged around climate change in general? Like, what is the weird sort of issue there? Is it partly just that we're not sure how to interface with it, or that it's sort of conceived to be an issue that the disciplines that we support will resolve? Like, I'm really curious, and this could also partly just be my own ignorance, because I really only sort of arrived to this question recently. So if folks have ideas, feel free to put it in the chat or even come on camera and talk. But yeah, like, what is the overall academic library's attitude towards climate issues in general? And are we thinking of things like those beyond maybe when we're doing like a retrofit on a building or something? Like, are we thinking about our daily institutional praxis? And I think saying, like, hey, how do we think about the climate costs of AI could actually be a really nice way to sort of wedge that door open into this broader question about, like, how does our library or our library system deal with climate reality, right? Like, climate change is real, and also we're sort of flirting with climate catastrophe, and what is our kind of ethical obligation as an institution to engage around that? So yeah, I really encourage you to keep that up, and I think that's a great and innovative way of looking at that question and that approach.
Thank you. So we have someone who's posed the question about whether you've been engaging with faculty and students at the University of Idaho on this topic, and maybe, or with other colleagues, perhaps in open education, and what their reaction has been.
I haven't actually. So you all were my first run of this. So I went big, and I really appreciate Sheena and UC Davis's sort of indulgence there to try a new topic on this. And so I've had a couple of conversations with students about AI. I work with a lot of pre-service teachers. And so it was interesting to talk to them about, like, how do you think about using AI for building assignments in the classroom? And I had one person say, like, it's really great for getting, like, situating information. Like, she's a math teacher, so she's like, I can get a little bit about Copernicus or whatever, and some basic grounding for what I'm going to have in the content. She's like, and it's kind of nice because it's sort of like an automated Wikipedia. And then she laughed though and was like, but of course it can't do math, and so I'm not like that worried about it, like taking over my job or whatever. So I think it's interesting the ways that a lot of the popular sort of media around AI dictates the conversations that people have, right? So a lot of the conversations that I have had with students have fallen more within these mainstream threads about it. Like, is AI going to take my job? Is it plagiarism if I do it? Is it okay if I use it academically? And I think to say to students, what's the environmental cost of it, we don't ask that enough about college, in my opinion. And I think it'll be really interesting to try to broach these topics here because we are a red state. And so there's not always the sort of like a liberal perspective that you might imagine in a blue state or even a purple state. But we're also a very resource heavy state. And so a lot of natural resources come from this region. And I think people often have really unique and pragmatic perspectives and also firsthand experiences with environmental contamination and degradation too. And so I think it's a rich place to start it. And yeah, I'm excited to see what I can do. And if there's other open educators who would like to collaborate on this, I would love to have a conversation, and especially to think about sort of the positive things that we might be able to do or the interventions. Someone mentioned Jonathan Lashley as being very environmentally focused. I haven't actually talked to him about this and was sort of shy about promoting this talk. So hopefully if he sees it, he'll let me know, and I should reach out to him. And someone says 5 minutes.
I
5 minutes
was
left.
jump in as your timekeeper as well. Yeah, so we've got about 5 minutes left, and folks are of course welcome to stay if you would like to continue the conversation. But the talk will officially sort of close out at noon, but we can invite folks to remain if you want to continue to pose any questions. I think one other challenge, I am from the Pacific Northwest myself, and so I think that one challenge we often face is that there's a perception that there is more fresh water available in the Pacific Northwest region than, and certainly in comparison to, Arizona, where a lot of these data centers are popping up. But I'd say one of the challenges that you addressed in the talk is this issue of transparency and the actual data that's available about water usage. And I know for data centers, the one in Dalles, Oregon, for example, you have these companies purchasing water rights and thus being able to avoid reporting water usage. So I do wonder to what extent we in higher education can perhaps put more pressure on transparency for the sake of data disclosure as a means of being able to calculate these costs. And I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about that in having to try to collect this data for your talk.
Yeah. I would say, for this talk, I really did rely a lot on sort of public facing general news sources, and then kind of following up and checking that there was some good underlying academic research there, or otherwise fact checking it. I actually did not know that about the Dalles data center, and I find that particularly infuriating. I feel extremely worried about salmon extinction, and you're right, there's a sort of perception that there's a lot of water and power in the Pacific Northwest, and that both are plentiful and cheap, and the power is coming at extraordinary and environmental and cultural costs. A lot of conservationists are really saying we're rapidly running out of generations of fish that are going to return at all, which puts salmon extinction sort of always on the verge of something that could happen. And I think especially as we're seeing more extreme and unpredictable climate events too, we really run into some serious risks there. And I think that's a violation of treaties with the tribes that have rights to that water. And I find that incredible too, that companies are able to do that. And I think transparency is really key. And I think it's partly up to faculty to kind of demand that when selecting resources, and again, to kind of come back to the way in which faculty will often be super critical in their discipline and then very kind of open and uncritical about new technologies, and often just not thinking about this environmental angle. And so, I don't mean for the message to be like, don't ever use AI, but I, for instance, would love to use AI to suggest to educators here, like, let kids have conversations about the dam removal on the Columbia River with AI that you can't openly have in class. And to me, that would be an actual sort of benefit where you're like, oh, there is this environmental burden from using this technology. And we're also taking the promise that it offers or the utility that it offers, and we're using that to help these younger minds answer their own questions honestly in a way that unfortunately we can't in some of these more censored environments. And so, yeah, I think transparency is key. And yeah, Sheena, if you want to write a paper about this, I think that would be great. So just just let me know. You got my deets.